Hey guys, it's Scott from fxmissions.com. Just a note, I've finished the trilogy of anthologies from the Forefront, and all 3 books are currently available on Amazon.
Welcome to From the Forefront, an FX Missions podcast with your host, Scott McClelland. Far and wide, and sometimes here at home, these bold and courageous souls that answer the call to missions have a steely metal that insists pioneering be part of their daily routine. Let's gather today and learn from those on the forefront. Here's Scott.
Hi, Scott McClelland here for your FX Missions From the Forefront podcast. Thanks for joining us. Please do share this podcast and any other Forefront podcast you'd like to share with someone who is interested in the subject of missions. Maybe they're just starting to think about it. And we want to be an encouragement to you guys for that. We are back with a second session here with Will Shehee. And howdy, Will. How are you?
All right. It's good to be back, Scott.
Great to have you back. And not only that, we have experienced an upgrade. I'm going to call it. I'm going to say we've been upgraded.
To say that.
Will is joined by Etta, and Will seem a lot less interesting from our previous podcast. Don't hold that against us.
Yeah.
Hi, Etta. How are you?
I'm doing great, Scott. Thank you so much for making sure I got on with you all.
Yes. Well, hey, it's one story, right? And we both have a part in it. I'm talking about in marriage and in the common experience that we have together. And we didn't just want to get half the story. So thank you. I appreciate it.
She brings the tender touch. If you want to get the good, deep heart stuff, you got to bring Etta in.
I love it.
Amen. Yeah. I get it and can relate on so many levels. So, yeah, really appreciate you guys being here. I think in terms of kind of stepping out from our previous recording, and we may break this into a couple of sessions, I think we kind of just got warmed up, really, before we ran out of runway, Will, on the, the subject of missions, you guys, long-term in Uganda. You know, how you got there, what the process was like, how you got prepared. Yep. If we can, let's step in now into some of those first missions experiences. I'm curious how getting there, I think you guys went on a short-term trip and then, or maybe some variety of short-term trips, and then you finally ended up long-term.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So what was, if there was, and I'd like for both of you guys to give perspective on this, what was different than what you expected when you got to the foreign field?
Well, I know for me, when we first reached Gulu, which is in the north of Uganda, we had been a couple other places in Africa by then. And what was startling is it just felt like home. It was so foreign in every way that you could possibly imagine. And yet the feeling was, I think we're home. This is where we belong. That's what was surprising to me.
Wow, I'm surprised too. Go ahead, Etta.
That's interesting because the first thing that came to my mind was what was so different that you don't really experience when you're there for a couple weeks, that you experience once you land, is the difference basically in culture. Just being there a few weeks, I built relationships with people. I, loved it. And those relationships were still there when we went back long term. But then kind of the hard realities that my expectations interrelationally and relationship wise were very not lined up with what they probably should have been. Like, for instance, we found out that we were pregnant shortly after moving, and I expected my friends there to rejoice with me. But it was a very odd, awkward, it's not something culturally that you talk about. You don't tell people you're pregnant. You don't even talk about it till after the baby's born. And it just kind of, people's reaction set me up for being thrown off kilter. And so there were several things, even kind of accidentally offending people, not knowing that I was, that just kind of shook me up. And, having to find that new normal within all the relationships was very different.
I do a lot of short-term work, and one thing I've noticed kind of relates to what you're saying. When you're in a short-term context with folks, and this is going to sound a little bit crass, I think, or I'm not sure exactly what it's going to sound like, but you can tolerate anybody for a couple of weeks, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and they can tolerate you for a couple of weeks.
We call that the honeymoon phase.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. When you park the RV and get out for a year, that's a different kind of thing. And that's when, as you say, the cultural differences start to, bleed into the environment. And really, I think we don't realize that we're culturally programmed so much differently. You face kind of a ledge, right? You come up to a ledge and there's a drop off in terms of what you didn't know.
Yes.
That's hard.
Yeah.
That is hard. Yeah. The honeymoon phase ends in every area of life.
That's true.
Sorry, guys. I'm having a good time over here. Thanks for joining me. No.
Yeah. That's when it goes from being the feelings, of like excitement and love or whatever, like being in love, to being like, no, this is where it gets real. Like, am I committed to the well-being of this people, even on the days where I don't like them? Because you're not always going to feel love for that people. Half the time you want to strangle them, but
right, yeah.
But real agape love, is on the days where you don't like them, are you still going to show up and you're still going to do what's best for the people, to build them up in the Lord and stay committed and not leave and see it through. That's real love, and it's tested in that furnace of cross-cultural rubs and culture shock, and that nitty-gritty day-to-day where you're aggravated and frustrated or hurt or offended, and then you still keep showing up and you still keep saying yes and you still keep loving people. That is where love is tested and proven.
Well, and I think we forget, that's the way life is, right? No matter where you're living, those same dynamics. I think we have a romantic notion toward missions, that you'll just be floating along in a stream of God's grace that is full of water, and you're never going to touch bottom, and that's. I think for me, it's important that I help remove the romantic notions that people have about missions, because that is really, it's a roadblock to being effective in a missions calling. So you guys are helping me do that.
Well, the thing that helped me the most after we went for 5 months, came back, got another year of training, and then went back permanently. And that year of training, the thing that helped me the most was learning about culture shock. I studied it out, and it's actually a thing. It's like a psychological phenomenon that happens in the human heart. Just like with grief, they say there's the 5 stages of grief and everybody goes through it. Well, it's the same with culture shock. There's 3 stages of culture shock that you go through, and it's not linear, it's cyclical. You keep going through it and going through it. But learning about that helped my heart so much to be like, I'm not a bad Christian or a bad missionary because, I'm in the phase of culture shock where I don't like anything about Ugandans and I just want to leave. If I didn't know that, then I would feel like such a loser, but I realized this is part of the journey, and you just got to hang in there, and keep showing up and not leave. And then you'll come out of it to the place of acceptance, where you realize it's different. It's not perfect, but it is the way it is. I'm not going to change it. I'll do what I can, but I don't need to go on a crusade to change each and every little thing that frustrates me, and you get to that point of acceptance after you fight that battle. But it helped me so much to not feel completely disqualified, as I'm going through those hard days. And let me tell you, it doesn't end. I mean, 10 years in, I still get into that part of the cycle of culture shock where it's like, but you come out of it, and that's good. I mean, that's the thing you got to know. There's light at the end of the tunnel.
Wow. Yes. How long does it take you, or how long did it take you guys? I would guess that the official language in Uganda is English, but am I right?
Yeah.
Or how long?
You're right.
What are you speaking English every day over there, or how's that going?
Well, English can mean a lot of things. We're speaking Ugandan English, which is kind of its own language. It's very British and very different. And so, but people where we are, people get around with English. So we are the missionaries who've been there 10 years and never learned a second language.
Yeah,
We're those guys.
Yeah. Well, English, I mean, like you say, the King's English, right?
Right, exactly.
Or the Queen's English. I get that also in, with the work we do in Kenya. It's English, but it's probably a hybrid, even from anything recognizable. It's kind of its own, and then they mix in, I guess, is Swahili present at all in your context?
Yep. Oh yeah. We've got 5 languages in Tororo. And so English is kind of English plus a bunch of loaner words from the other 4 languages. Swahili's one of them. And then there's 2 tribal languages. And then there's the more kind of national tribal dialect of Uganda. And all 5 of them are kind of mixed together in this hodgepodge.
Yeah, I track with that for sure. Etta, would you tell us a little bit about your experience, the cultural, initial cultural experiences that you had, in addition to the one you mentioned before? What was it like for you?
Well, I think there was a lot of kind of realizing things in retrospect that were hard, like ways that I had, when I mentioned offending people, you'd have the gossip going around the neighborhood that, so-and-so came over and she didn't offer them a drink. She didn't even give them soda, much less food. That was just, I think it's a little painful when you realize that, without knowing, that you're hurting people. I had someone who I had grown in friendship with, and I guess we got to be close enough friends where she could tell me that she felt like I was a selfish and a stingy person because I didn't make twice as much to eat at dinner than my family would eat. And I said, well, I just don't want to throw away food. I just try to make what. And she said, no, that's selfish because you don't know when so-and-so or so-and-so or so-and-so is going to stop by, and you have to have enough made for them. And so there were things like that. I think one of the hardest, I guess mostly cultural, but it was pretty convoluted of a bunch of different things and circumstances that has taken me these whole last 9 or 10 years to sort out and pray through with the Lord. But it's when we took in a child from the slum area, and she had initially asked us just to send her to school, get her caught up in school. She'd been out of school for about 5 years. And then it just pretty quickly, developed into her needing to stay with us where she wasn't safe and all of those things. And, with time, like I said, those friendships that I had made the whole time, of course, that's taking in a child from that area is not easy for anyone or any family, but you're doing it out of love, and you're doing it because you're an ambassador of Jesus. Like, this is what he wants for, those suffering, and, he wants to bring about justice, and what's right is not that this child wouldn't be in school, all of those things. To say that then we threw this very confusing element on when my Ugandan friends began to tell me that I was actually doing her an injustice, and what I was doing was the worst thing possible for her. And I would ask them, but it always felt very, confusing, and they wouldn't quite open up. Finally, one of them said, well, you're spoiling her. And I thought, well, I could see that perspective just because we do live with running water. I'm going, oh, I make her sweep her room. I make her make up her bed, but it's taken me all these years to realize that, what they were saying was basically, she's not going to make a good wife because she's not learning how to fetch water from the water hole. She's not learning how to cook all the local foods. She's not learning how to dig and hoe and weed in the garden and all these things that someone, basically what they would say, a village wife would do, because those who live in the village are those that haven't gone through, finished high school or had any university or anything. And they could see that the hope of this girl getting ahead was very slim. And so what they were meaning, but either they couldn't communicate it to me, or I wasn't in a position of understanding that world well enough yet to realize or know that I could actually be setting her up for failure in her own culture if, her kind of getting by was going to be to, get married. And their marriage is not like it is here. It's not, the primary thing isn't, oh, you love to have a loving friendship and partnership with this person. It's more of a provision thing, and it's can be more like a business interaction where, yes, the husband has to pay dowry because that woman who's learned how to fetch water and cook the foods and grow all the food and everything is very, very valuable to her tribe and her village. And now you're taking her away because she's going to provide that for you and children and grow your tribe. And so I was kind of taking away that kind of value from her by having this sense of hope. And so it's just taken me years to understand what they were saying then. And then, my goodness, how to navigate that and the situation we were in. I just thank God that He's the God that sorts it all out and it's not up to me. But that probably is one of the most poignant examples I could give.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think because the worlds are so dissimilar, that we don't really have a place to put the comments sometimes when we get to a level of trust to be able to get transparency from someone else. It's hard for us to put those comments because we're thinking about what our intentions were, right? Not maybe those outcomes that seemed obvious to everyone but us. We're thinking, hey, clearly it makes sense for us to help on the education side or whatever. And you're ruining her potential of getting into or perpetuating the system that is in normal life for everybody around there. I've been through a couple of those things, and I've mostly learned what I didn't know. I didn't maybe come out too good in those things. I mean, I was kind of stumped at times, and I could see what you're saying there being the same thing. Help us, Lord, right? We got to have some help here. And to do everything in love, at the end of the day, that's more than just a good guideline.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's so important.
I comfort myself, in a lot of things, like you saying, and you do it out of love. Like, there is love, there is wisdom, there is all these things. But at the end of the day, the Lord says the greatest of these is love. And I picture myself standing before Him often because I need to for all these various things that I face. And, this child, he's not going to ask me, how successful were you, with her? How did this turn out? He's going to ask me, did you grow in love? Did you grow in love? Did your heart grow in love? Did you show her my love? That's going to be the question when I stand before Him. And so I'm going, okay, if my answer can't be that, then I realign my heart for that to be my answer, And if it is, then I just try to lean into trusting Him with the outcomes and with the rest.
Yes. Navigating those things is,
Exactly.
Yes, I think at a minimum, we grow in effectiveness little by little, but we can, obviously, all of life is a purification of motives, right? We're getting scrubbed a little bit so that our motives, match the Lord's motives. And I think that's the point in a big sense, as you clearly indicated. And I'm thankful to have already learned that. And obviously I continue to learn it as we do. So just switching gears here a little bit, I want to kind of get into a subject that is going to be challenging, I think, for us to get all the way through, but it is a part of your story, and I appreciate you guys when your willingness to share it. But early on in your time there, and I don't know exactly how early on it was, but pretty early on, you guys suffered a pretty big loss while you're on the field. And it was very nearly a bigger loss than it was in terms of, if possible, that may be hard to say or hard to say like that. But can you guys dig into the story a little bit there for us? I don't know how long you were on the field, but if you can just frame that up a little bit for us and talk about what happened to you guys and your family early on.
Yeah. So it was at the end of 2013. So I guess we've been on the mission field for 3 or 4 years by then. Etta was pregnant with our 4th child, Lydia. And this was December. And Lydia was really late. So, a week late, 2 weeks late, 2.5 weeks late. And
well, let me say this. It was drawn out too because the health care was about 5 to 6 hours from where we lived. So we had to rent a house, take all of our children there and a babysitter for whenever she does decide to come and wait. And so, and leading up to Christmas too, it got it may have seemed a lot longer than if we were in regular circumstances.
And any woman who's gone late on her pregnancy knows that you are ready to get that baby out by that point, 2.5 weeks late. So every day, Etta and I would take these walks, and I'd try to encourage her and comfort her. And what the Lord had given me to comfort her with was Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1 and 2. It says, there's an appointed time for everything. There is a time for every event under heaven, a time for birth and a time to die. And I would just encourage her, hey, there's a time for this baby to be born. The Lord's picked the day for Lydia's birth. Acts 1:7 says, it's not for you to know the times and the seasons, but they've been fixed by my Father's own divine authority. And so I just encourage her, God has chosen this day. He's appointed the hour for Lydia. Don't worry about when she's coming. And this was what we were really comforting ourselves on. So then we had the baby, and it was awesome. We took her home on Christmas Day, and just a really, really special time as a family. And about 5 weeks later, we had to go back to the capital city, about 5 hours away, to register her birth with the U.S. Embassy and the consular. And we finished that. And we're driving back to our home 5 hours away, and it got dark along the way. And as we were driving, it was probably around 9 or 10 at night. And so it was pitch black, can't see anything.
There's no street lights there.
Yeah, there's no ambient light of any kind. So it's very, very, very dark. And someone passes me. It's like a 2-lane highway. And we're going maybe 50 miles an hour or so. They pass me with their bright lights on. And it blinds me for a second. I can't really see anything. And as soon as I can see again, lo and behold, right in front of me, they said about 8 meters in front of me, is a semi truck. It's a tanker truck that's parked and stopped and broken down in my lane. There wasn't any tail lights or anything, so it just came out of nowhere. And I tried to slam on brakes and swerve into the other lane, but it was too late. And we just collided with the back of this steel tanker truck. And we were in a minibus, so there's no hood or anything. So the impact, the whole vehicle just crushed in around us. The windshield burst, and our legs were, just the whole thing crushed in on us. And so I cry out to Etta, and I'm like, Etta, are you okay? And she's not responding. And so I run around. My arm was broken. But I jump out and I run around and I try to get her out, and I can't get her door open because it's all crushed. And pedestrians start showing up, and somebody stands up and starts telling people what to do. And they get an axe out and they cut the door off because there's no emergency response vehicles. And they are finally get the door off. They can't get Etta out. Her legs are pinned. And she looks so bad, her face is all, she's missing teeth and her face is all cut up and her legs are pinned. And so what they end up doing is tying the front of our vehicle to the truck in front of us and the back to another truck. And they just that guy reverses and just stretches the van out. And eventually they're able to get Etta out and take her to the hospital. And one amazing thing that happened in that moment is my phone disappeared in the accident. I guess someone stole it or something shortly after. So I couldn't call my friend to come pick us up and take us to the hospital. And there's no 911 service. So we didn't have any way to get to the hospital. But a guy came up to me and he said, "Hey, who are you? Where do you work? What organization are you with?" And I told him, and he knew us. He knew our people. And so he called our organization. He had him in his phone, called our matron of students, and she called Jesse, my friend. And within a few minutes of the accident, he was on his way to come get us. Well, it turns out that guy was the same guy who was passing me and blinded me out. And in a way, he was responsible for the accident in his own way, and he was going to leave because in Uganda, you do not stop at the scene of the accident. The mob will mob you and, do mob justice and put you to death. That's what happens in Uganda. Right. So he goes to hit the accelerator and leave the scene of the accident, and his car won't accelerate. And the Lord says to him, "Get out and help these people." Well, it turns out he's a pastor. So he gets out to help us. And he's the guy who knew our people and called them. And then he's the guy who took charge of the accident scene so people didn't do banditry and rob us. He said, "No, we got to help these people. You do this and you do that." And he used to be a police officer. So he took command of the scene and got everybody helping us. So I just really, it's amazing God's goodness in the midst of all of this. He was getting the people in the right places to do the right thing. And Jesse picks us up, takes us to the hospital.
Well, let me just throw in there too, because I love to tell it all, because you do begin to see God in every, detail and what seems like the impossible, because, you mentioned that you've done work in Kenya. We are on that main, highway that goes between Nairobi and Kampala. We're not in Tororo. We're still about 30 minutes out. Those pedestrians around are from those villages there. So it's not like we would be in a common place where anyone would know us, know that we're from or connected in Tororo, like nothing like that. So the fact that this man was from Tororo and knew that alone was so huge.
Yeah. Just imagine a random person on the interstate who has your friend's number in his phone.
And time was of the essence. For my life, if we had have been stranded much longer, I mean, my life was definitely on the line with time. And so you just see God's hand in all of it. Go ahead, honey.
So we get to the hospital and Etta's still unconscious. I mean, her femur's broken all the way through. She's got 5 or 6 different breaks in her hip, pelvis, clavicle, everything.
Well, we didn't know that then, but just to say I was
she was beat up and
totally beat up.
And we get to the hospital, and this is the main hospital, the government hospital, and the lights are off. It's like 10 at night. We go in and we have to wake the nurses up and say, "Hey, we're having an emergency." And they're like, okay, let's make some tea, and we're just like, and they call the doctor. Well, the doctor doesn't even show up for an hour. And when he shows up, he's got alcohol in his breath and all this stuff. So we're trying to just kind of stabilize her. And I'm just frantic, and I'm praying, and I'm like, part of me's feeling completely responsible. And Etta's not responding. The baby's not responding. She's not waking up. She's not crying. And I'm just like feeling the weight of, this is all my fault. I was the one driving. I should have seen that car. I should have been driving more slowly and carefully, or we should have left Kampala earlier so we wouldn't be driving at night. And I should have left my high beams on, and I should have all these things going on in my mind. And so I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, my wife might die, my baby might die, and this is all my fault. And so I'm praying and contending with God, for healing and to save their life. And at the same time, I'm carrying the weight of it all, and I'm just frantic, And so as I'm praying, though, the Lord breaks in that moment, and he tells me, he says, I'm sovereign over life and death. And he brings back to my mind what he had taught us about Lydia's birth. In that Ecclesiastes 3:2, he says, there's a time and a season appointed for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. And I never thought about the second part of that verse. We knew there was a time for Lydia to be appointed, a time appointed for Lydia to be born. We said, it's also true that there's a time appointed for her to die. And I am sovereign over life and death. I alone hold the keys to death and Hades. And nobody can open that door, and nobody can keep it closed except for me. And in that moment, everything shifted in a second. And it was like, if God is sovereign over life and death, then there's no one to blame. It's not any man's fault if someone is born or if someone dies. These things belong to God's own divine authority. And it released something in my heart. I just tell you, in that moment, it all came off. And I knew that I'm not to blame, I've just got to lean into God's sovereignty and trust him with whatever the outcome is, and try to be faithful to do my part and pray. But at the end of the day, it all belongs to God, and there's nothing to blame. It's just to trust, not to blame a person, but to trust the Lord. And it just broke all of that off. And I didn't feel the weight of it anymore. And I got into this place of peace and trusting the Lord with all things.
I'll never forget one of the friends that showed up at the airport later said that he'll never forget walking in, and that you were there saying, your head is of finest gold. And that's Song of Solomon, I believe, chapter 5, where the bride just talks on and on about her beloved. But one of the things she says, your head is of the finest gold. Like, your leadership is perfect. And he said, I found you in peace, just proclaiming that truth.
Yeah.
Wow. I think sometimes we think we have to understand in order to trust, right? But really, in order to understand, we've got to trust before understanding, right? I mean, I think if we're working from a foundation of trust, we are going to understand a lot more than we would if we're working from a foundation of understanding. We got to get that right.
When you're in these moments of crisis, it is not the time to put God on trial. You know what I'm saying? Like, when the whole world's falling apart around you, is not the time to be like, well, God, are you really loving? Are you really sovereign? Are you really wise? Are you really faithful? Are you really good? It's like, you've got to have this journey with God ahead of time where you've tested and proven him in all of these areas. And then when the crisis hits, that's not the time to question God. That's the time to stand, on what you know to be true about God. Like, having done all this, stand. And you got to stand on what you know, and not doubt in the darkness what he's revealed to you in the light. It's the time to remember, it's time to remember his faithfulness. Say, he's never failed me yet, and he won't fail me now, and that's what you got to understand. You don't have to understand the reason that these things are happening, but what you do have to understand is who God is and the knowledge of God that you've cultivated in your own faith journey with him. That's what you got to stand on.
Well, he began to roll through all of this, later on. But I just feel like what I can say is that he really taught me a lot about what faith is. We say it all the time. It's believing what you don't see. Too often we think of it as, a circumstance, he's never going to let us down, but we decide what letting us down is. It's the money didn't come through, or the this, or whatever I was believing in faith, the healing didn't come through. Whatever I was believing in faith didn't happen. But he was saying, he's like, in the hospital room, I remember looking around. I could not literally move. This was days later, not at the point of the story we're at. I still wasn't comprehensive, but clearly I'm talking now. So I did live. You've got that part of the story.
Right.
But I'm going, wow, all the circumstances, I can't move my body. I can't, like, this and that and the other, like, would say that you're not good. But
Yeah.
I know, like, I just knew in my heart, like, my declaration, you are good. You are. And he's just like, yes. And that, like, you've ravished my heart. Like, one, declaration in the darkness of what he's shown us in the light, that stake in the ground, like, that is the faith that Jesus is talking about when he says, hey guys, when I come back, will I find faith on the earth?
Mm-hmm.
When he comes back, it's going to be looking pretty bad, like our circumstances we were believing for in faith are probably going to be looking bad, but he's doing the First Peter thing. He's taking us through the trials and the testings of what? Of our faith, so that it would be of pure gold, meaning it would be staked upon him and upon his character. Yeah. And we have to remember everything we've gone through. It's why David in Psalms, he's always saying, remember, I'll remember how you did this. I'll remember how you did that, because we're going to have those stakes, the overcoming by the word of our testimony, of our stories. Like, we're going to have that to stand in faith. I think Will and I both could say, we look back over our lives and story, and, we had fought so many smaller battles. I'll hear Will talk about, that this was like a Goliath time in our lives. But just like David said before he fought Goliath, it's not my first battle. I've already killed the bear. I've already killed the lion. It's like, we look back where now it seems like such small trials that were massive to us at the time.
Yeah.
But when we walked through them and we fought the good fight of faith, it prepared us for now this, where, like Will said, pretty shortly thereafter, he's no longer in that battle. He's already come to that place of resting in the midst of the warfare on God's sovereignty, because he knows that he knows that he knows God's good no matter what the outcome is.
Wow. Well, thank you both for sharing, about that, and both, from both perspectives there. And I know they're one perspective, but the different vantage points, I think, really helps us to relate. In this particular case, one of you guys was largely incapacitated. You, like you say, you couldn't move, you were unconscious, the impact was very direct in that regard. And obviously the surrounding perspective, like you were saying, Will, where you're trying to sync up to the situation. And, there's trauma right there. There's almost a disconnect. You've got a near shock experience going on. There's a lot going on in that time, even though it seems like time stands still. There's a bunch of stuff going on spiritually and emotionally and in every way.
Yep.
You've been listening to From the Forefront, hosted by FX Mission's Scott McClelland. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like more information on today's guest, please go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/FXmissions. Please rate our show on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. If you know someone who should be a guest on our podcast, we're currently reviewing candidates for upcoming episodes. Please submit their name, affiliation, and an essay of why their story needs to be told to info@fxmissions.com. And of course, you can always follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our website at fxmissions.com. From Scott McClelland and the whole team here at FX Missions, thanks for listening. Till next time, have a great day.